Now we're going to look at the half brain. So you need a half brain specimen and turn the cut side of the brain upward in your dissecting pan. And we'll look at some of the structures of the half brain and start from the anterior aspect and work our way posteriorly. So the large cut structure that you can see here that's in a bit of a semicircle shape is the corpus callosum, and this is the band of fibers that joins the two hemispheres. And we can see on the corpus callosum there is a rostrum or nose area, there's a genu or a bend, a body, and then posteriorly the splenium of the corpus callosum. So those are the four parts of the corpus callosum. And if we look on the again in the midline, there is tissue, and most of that tissue has been removed here, but we still see a little bit left. This is called the septum pellucidum. It's a thin layer of tissue that separates the lateral ventricle from the midline. So the septum pellucidum, what little bit is left is here. This cut is a little bit off midline. And so we can see into the lateral ventricle right here, and there is a foramen or an opening from the lateral ventricle into the third ventricle, which would be this space here. And that opening is here. You can put your probe through it. That's called the foramen of Monro. And there's a foramen of Monro that goes from each lateral ventricle into the third ventricle. Now the third ventricle sits between the two thalami. So this is the thalamus right here. This particular area is called the thalamus. And this area right here on the thalamus is called the massa intermedia, or the interthalamic adhesion, and that's where the thalamic nucleus or thalamic nuclei from each side are adhered. That's not present in all brains. It's present in about 80%. Anterior to at the anterior edge of the thalamus, we see a ridge of tissue right here. This is actually a column of fibers called the fornix, and the fornix is involved in the hypothalamus, connections of the hypothalamus and the limbic system. We'll talk about that later in the semester. Anterior to the thalamus, you see a structure here that also interconnects the two hemispheres. This is called the anterior commissure. So the corpus callosum has fibers that interconnect the two hemispheres, as does the anterior commissure here. If we go inferiorly from the anterior commissure, we can see this area right here, which is called the hypothalamus. So this is the hypothalamus. You can see this, the medial part of the hypothalamus. So it is anterior and inferior to the thalamus. And the demarcation between the two is just a small sulcus, the hypothalamic sulcus right here. So it's a small depression between the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And then we can see a little bit of what's called the infundibulum, which is the stalk that attaches the pituitary to the hypothalamus, and of course the pituitary was left behind in the skull when the brain was removed. At the inferior edge of the hypothalamus, and a little more posteriorly, we see the cut edge of a rounded structure called the mammillary body, and the mammillary body is part of the hypothalamus. And then posterior to that, we are now in the brain stem, and we can see we cannot quite see the structure that joins the third ventricle to the fourth, and that structure is the cerebral aqueduct. But I can put my probe, because this again was a little off midline, I can put my probe down in the cerebral aqueduct here. So this is would be the midbrain right here. This is also part of the midbrain, and in between what's called the tegmentum of the midbrain and the tectum of the midbrain is a depression, a canal called the cerebral aqueduct, and cerebral spinal fluid flows from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle through that cerebral aqueduct. If we trace the cerebral aqueduct down, we see a cavity which is between the cerebellum posteriorly and the pons anteriorly, and this cavity is the fourth ventricle. And so it's has sort of a rhomboid shape to it. And there are 3 openings out of the fourth ventricle laterally to foramina called the foramina of Luschka. And so you can remember that because Luschka starts with an L and it's lateral. And there's a foramen right in the midline, so you can see part of that foramen, half of it, and that's the foramen of Magendie. And remember that because Magendie starts with an M, which also, midline also starts with an M. And then we can also barely see the spinal canal, so a little faint line right here. This is the spinal canal, so cerebral spinal fluid can flow down through the spinal canal as well. Now, a couple of other structures that we missed up here in the half brain. Right in this area, just anterior to the splenium of the corpus callosum, but posterior to the thalamus, would be a rounded structure called the pineal body, and that's a single structure in the midline that is not present on this brain. It probably was left over to the other side of this half brain. And then there's a tiny little band of fibers just anterior to that splenium of the corpus callosum right here. This is the posterior commissure, and that is another connection between the two hemispheres.